As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So Samantha Power, who is the head of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, or just USAID, she said on Wednesday that some parts of northern Gaza are already experiencing famine, which of course has been created by this U.S.-backed Israeli bombardment and siege on the Gaza Strip. So Power made these comments in a House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing when asked about a cable sent by USAID to other U.S. government agencies that said famine was already likely taking place in parts of northern Gaza, and the cable also called the spread of hunger and disease unprecedented in modern history. And again, this is a U.S. government agency that is saying this. And Power said that the cable was based on a report from the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, and she told lawmakers that the assessment was credible. And she was asked if that meant famine was already occurring in northern Gaza, and she replied yes. She said, quote, "Food has not flowed in sufficient quantities to avoid this imminent famine in the south, and these conditions that are already giving rise already to child deaths in the north," end quote. A top U.S. government official saying, yeah, famine is already taking place in some parts of Gaza, yet the U.S. is continuing to support the military that is causing it. And Power, there's a lot to be said about her. She's she was in the Obama administration, and she, along with Hillary Clinton, really pushed for the intervention in Libya, which was a total disaster. She fancies herself as an expert on genocide, yet she's part of a government that is aiding and abetting this slaughter and starvation of Palestinian civilians and children in the Gaza Strip. So there's a lot we could say about her, but just the fact that here we have the head of a major, U.S. government agency saying this, it just really shows how shameful all of this is. And President Biden has refused to even call for a ceasefire. He walked back those comments that sounded like he was calling for one without any sort of hostage deal. So that's not happening. And last week, Israel said that it would take steps to increase the flow of aid into Gaza, including the opening of the Erez border crossing into northern Gaza and allowing shipments to come through Israel's port of Ashdod. But neither commitment has been implemented. There was another report from the New York Times on Thursday that says the border crossing still hasn't been open. And it also said that the UN is disputing Israel's numbers of aid trucks that are entering Gaza. So famine is happening. The U.S. is enabling and supporting it. And this somehow continues. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida delivered an address to Congress on Thursday and declared China the greatest strategic challenge facing the world. I feel like this went very unnoticed, but this was a foreign leader coming in and addressing Congress and saying all this very hawkish stuff about China, and everybody standing up and giving him a big round of applause throughout the speech. So he said, quote, "Close coordination between Japan and the U.S. is required more than ever to ensure that deterrence that our alliance provides remains credible and resilient. China's current external stance and military actions present the unprecedented and the greatest strategic challenge not only to the peace and security of Japan, but to the peace and the stability of the international community at large," end quote. He also praised the U.S. for its role in leading the Western proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. Kishida said, quote, "The Ukraine of today may be the East Asia of tomorrow. The leadership of the United States is indispensable. Without U.S. support, how long before the hopes of Ukraine would collapse under the onslaught from Moscow," end quote. Without U.S. support, how quickly would have Zelensky signed a peace deal? So that was, he didn't say that, obviously. That was me. But a day earlier, so this was on Thursday that he addressed Congress. The day before, Biden hosted Kishida in this big dinner at the White House, and the two leaders announced new steps to bolster the U.S.-Japan alliance, including an upgrade to military command and control structures to facilitate more military cooperation. They said in a joint statement, quote, "We announce our intention to bilaterally upgrade our respective command and control frameworks to enable seamless integration of operations and capabilities and allow for greater interoperability and planning between U.S. and Japanese forces in peacetime and during contingencies," end quote. They also announced plans to increase joint weapons production and the potential inclusion of Japan in the AUKUS military pact. That's that military alliance that was formed between the US, Australia, and the UK, started in 2021. It's focused on technology sharing. They're going to sell Australia some nuclear-powered submarines, and eventually Australia is going to be able to make their own. It's going to take decades and decades and cost like hundreds of billions of dollars. It's completely insane. Articles from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. A top U.S. commander told Congress that NATO was prepared for a massive troop surge in Eastern Europe. The alliance has already positioned thousands of troops in its most eastward states. This is General Christopher Cavoli, head of U.S. European Command, told Congress on Wednesday that NATO is prepared to triple its troop deployments to Eastern Europe. And so this is something that they've been talking about. I believe the U.S. sent something like 20,000 troops to Europe, and most of them went to Eastern Europe, to Romania, to Poland, to these countries either bordering Ukraine, and then also in the Baltic states that actually border Russia. And Kyle mentions the story I covered earlier this week of Germany just started its first permanent military deployment in Lithuania. So this is something that kind of a long-term plan, I think, to keep building up in Eastern Europe, and also in the new NATO countries in Finland and Sweden. And Finland, of course, has a huge border with Russia, and the U.S. is going to get access to a bunch of bases there.
The Peter Schiff Show.
You know, I did hear some people, though, on CNBC finally saying what I was saying over the last couple of weeks, which is, why is everybody talking about when the Fed is going to start cutting rates or how many rate cuts we're going to have when the Fed should be hiking rates? And so they're now starting to say, maybe we're not going to get any cuts. They're not saying that we're going to get hikes. They're saying that's no, that's never going to happen. But they are starting to question the validity of the cuts. But nobody is questioning the reality of the fact that they should never have stopped hiking. That's what the rising gold price is signaling, that interest rates are too low and that they need to go up. Not just in the U.S., they need to go up everywhere. The Europeans, the ECB has to raise rates. The Bank of England has to raise rates. The Bank of Japan has to raise rates. Everybody has to raise rates sharply. I'm not talking about, mamby-pamby quarter-point rate hikes. We need 200 basis point hikes. We need serious. The central bankers need to know let the markets know that they mean business. The central bankers have to let the governments know that they mean business, that, hey, you guys better cut your spending. You can't run these big fiscal deficits because we're raising rates. You can't afford to finance the debt. So you better get rid of the debt by getting rid of the deficits, right? That's what has to happen. That's what gold is telling you. And everybody is ignoring it. So gold at its peak was up about $60 early in the morning. The high that we hit was about 2,430. That's already better than a 20% move above 2,000. So we are way above what used to be resistance. That's now distance support. And I was saying on this podcast, in fact, the last time gold went below 2,000, I said that's the last time. I said this is gold's final shakeout. This is your last chance to get it below 2,000. It was back above 2,000 a day or two later, and it never looked back. And now we've moved up more than 20% from 2,000. We ain't going back. So if you didn't buy gold below 2,000 when I was, screaming at you to buy it, well, you can't. You're not going to buy it below 2,000 again. You probably won't be able to buy it below 2,200. You can buy it below 2,400 because it's sold off. Maybe you'll be able to get to buy it below 2,300, but I don't know. This rally is going to continue because nobody even realizes it's happening. Americans are still selling. They're still liquidating their gold. That's how dumb they are, or we are. I mean, I'm an American. But the rallies have really all started in the Asian time zone. All the sell-offs happen here. The same thing happened today. We got a sell-off here, although we extended the rally first. So I think some buyers came in, but then the sellers came back. So gold got as high as 23 or 24.30. And again, when the markets open up on Sunday night, Monday in Asia, they're going to be looking at a buying opportunity because the smart money is buying gold and silver. The central banks, the foreign central banks, gold has been moving from west to east. So we sell, they buy. And so I believe there's going to be buying coming in to the gold and silver market. Maybe there'll be an initial sell-off on the follow-through with what we did. But I expect big buyers to come in as they have been over the past several months. The sellers are here. Why? Because Americans are dumb. They're selling their real gold to buy fool's gold, Bitcoin ETFs. The West, or the East rather, is taking advantage of our greed and ignorance, and they're buying real gold as much as they can get their hands on, because this is a significant event. This is the beginning of the end of dollar hegemony, the U.S. dominance of the global economy, the dollar's days as the world reserve currency are numbered. Foreign central banks don't want dollars. They don't want treasuries, even if we pay them 5% to hold them, because they know that that's still a losing proposition, because inflation is going to be higher than that. And again, hotter than expected inflation does not mean the Fed just has to fight a little harder to win. It means the Fed has already lost. Inflation won. The fight is over, and you buy gold. And so what happened? So on Wednesday, we got the CPI. And the expectation was for a 0.3% rise, which, if you annualize that, is still well north of the 2% target that the Fed claims we're on a glide path to hit. The prior month was 0.4. So we ended up getting 0.4 again. So ahead of the 0.2% that people were expecting. But if you figure we've got 0.4 2 months in a row for CPI, well, what if you annualize that? You know, we got it 2 months, so annualize it 6 more times. That's 5% inflation. 5 seems like it's a lot higher than 2. And if you're at 5 right now, and you're trending up, right, because we bottomed out lower. We've been trending higher in inflation for, I don't know, 6 months, 8 months. I forget. We bottomed out around 3.1 year over year. The year over year now is 3.5. And the year over year core is 3.8. So we never actually got even close to 2. And now we're headed back up. So based on that data, how does the Fed conclude that we're likely headed down to 2 and that they can start cutting rates? I mean, if you were objective and just looking at the CPI, you would say, oh, we better hike rates. Inflation is going up, not down. But they're still saying, no, we're expecting to cut rates. Why? Based on what would you expect to cut rates? Certainly not based on the data.
And started out with something called the North Carolina Provincial Congress. This is a very revolutionary move at the time, and Wikipedia describes it as extra legal unicameral legislative bodies formed in 1774 through 1776 by the people of the province of North Carolina, independent of British colonial government. So what they were doing is they were forming their own representative or legislative bodies, despite the fact that, well, the parliament said, you really can't do this. This was very revolutionary at the time. And eventually, sooner or later, when you're taking on the empire, you got to start organizing whether they approve of it or not. And that's what they were showing us here. But anyways, there were 5 of them from 74 through 76 in North Carolina. They met in the towns of New Bern, the 1st and 2nd, Hillsborough, number 3, and Halifax was the 4th and 5th. Now, I think the 3rd one they're all very important, but later in 1775, we have the 3rd one. And this is where you really see kind of a ramping up, especially later in the year after Lexington and Concord had kicked off in April of that year, where they were really prepping for a military response. And the Congress then divided the state or the colony into 6 military districts for the purposes of organizing militia and for determining representation on a new provincial council. These districts included Edenton, Halifax, Hillsborough, New Bern, Salisbury, and Wilmington. Now, shortly after this, we have actually in February of 1776, I think it was the 27th, this is the first battle in the War for Independence in North Carolina. It's actually a very important one, but it's not discussed real often. We often think just Lexington and Concord, and then everything just went to town at that point. But this was a battle that happened at Moores Creek Bridge. Here from NCpedia, they describe it like this: called the Lexington and Concord of the South. It's kind of a big deal. The Battle of Moores Creek Bridge was significant for several reasons. First of all, it marked the permanent end of royal authority in North Carolina. I mean, by the time this had already happened, they were already organizing their own system without British approval. But this really hammered it home. It also prevented the British from seizing control of the South at the onset of the war. And it was also a very primary motivation for the next provincial Congress, which started very shortly after in April of 1776. And here's how Kelly Slapey at North Carolina History puts it: the Patriot victory was fresh on the minds of the members of the 4th Provincial Congress when they reconvened on April 4th, 1776 in Halifax. Independence seemed imminent. Colonel Robert Howe remarked to the assembly, quote, "Independence seems to be the word. I know of not one dissenting voice." If you think about what was going on, this radical change in the viewpoints of the people during the Revolution before the shots were fired at Lexington and Concord and also at Moores Creek Bridge, for example, the radical change was an understanding that all power flows from the people and government is really just an agent of them. We shouldn't be surprised that when Parliament heard things like that, there was going to be a conflict. But when you're thinking about government doing things that they're not supposed to do, committing treason by usurpations, that's a pretty big deal. So they go through listing they're concerned about dealing with all these usurpations and violences. And that was also a very similar phrase used in the Declaration of Independence. They talk about how we went through moderation. We've tried to go back to peacefully on constitutional principles, but they have procured no mitigation of the aforesaid wrongs and usurpations, and no hopes remain of obtaining redress by those means alone, which have been hitherto tried. Your committee are of the opinion that the House should enter into the following resolve. So this is what they recommended. Resolved that the delegates for this colony in the Continental Congress be empowered to concur with the delegates of the other colonies in declaring independency and forming foreign alliances, reserving to this colony the sole and exclusive right of forming a constitution and laws for this colony, and of appointing delegates from time to time under the direction of a general representation thereof to meet the delegates of the other colonies for such purposes as shall be hereafter pointed out. So in other words, they're saying we're authorizing you to vote for, not propose, but vote for independence with the other colonies, form foreign alliances, and create our own constitution. And here from Jason Mandrish over at Founder of the Day, he points out that this was the first instance of a rebel government officially admitting reconciliation was no longer an option. It wasn't even on the table anymore for them in Halifax at that point. And although the North Carolina delegation had been informed that they were to support independence, well, they were specifically told not to motion for a vote. I mean, they didn't put it in those words, but they said you are authorized to vote with others on independence. And although he said this may seem strange, it was a very calculated move. And this was for a reason, because all the delegates in Congress, unlike what we have today, took their responsibility to represent their colonies, their states, very seriously. And if you think about the representation in the Continental Congress, that's very similar to how the structure was originally supposed to be under the Constitution, representing the states, reporting back to the states, following some instructions potentially. If a motion was made to declare independence, everyone else at that time probably would have said no. So North Carolina received updated instructions. The other colonies had not. But really, what we're talking about is the first domino, making it official that they wanted out. They wanted independence. They were going to create their own constitution. And the rest of these other colonies started to fall. The domino started to fall pretty quickly. Now, on April 13th, the day after the Halifax resolves passed, the delegates then formed a committee to start working on a constitution. And here from All Things Liberty, they put it this way. The renowned Halifax resolves firmly announced that in addition to directing its delegates to vote for independence, North Carolina was, quote, resolving to this colony the sole and exclusive right of forming a constitution and the laws for this colony. It's hard to be more independent than saying, well, we are totally disregarding you guys. We're authorizing our people to vote for independence if we can get some unanimous support from the other colonies or if we can get support from the other colonies. But in the meantime, we are going to create our own constitution, our own government. We don't care. They may say they still have power, but we're creating our own. And so they started working on that almost immediately. And it was ratified by the 5th Provincial Congress in December of 1776.